lecture. This is really a kind of political overview about the sustainable development goals generally, what I think they mean for Africa, and how I think Africa can finance some of what some of the major challenges are. So I'm very much looking at the perspective of sustainable development goals through the lens of how do you make international agreements work. And I think this is a good case study of the opportunities and the challenges with that. And my role in sustainable development goals is that when I was at the Centre for International Cooperation at New York University, I ran a program which offered a kind of track 2 diplomatic process for countries to talk about the sustainable development goal negotiations, outside the UN, kind of neutral space where they could fight things out without being at the UN. And then later I moved to the Wagner School of Public Service at NYU, where I now teach a class about globalization, making global governance work, especially in the context of this rising global populism, tensions that are emerging between great powers in the world. How in that context you make globalization work across countries. So that's my interest in these things. I'm not an economist, so I've got some statistics and figures for you, but they're really illustrative of what the scale of the challenges are. So what will I talk about today? So I'll start with a brief overview, what I think, what I suppose many people around the UN would say, what makes international agreements work? What are the essential ingredients for an agreement to be meaningful rather than just a piece of paper that never gets implemented? Secondly, I'll look at why do the Sustainable Development Goals matter for Africa, and how do they and don't they work for Africa on a very general level. Now, obviously, it's a bit too easy to lump some extremely different countries together in a single category of Africa, but anyway, and from a big perspective. And then thirdly, I'll look at, I think, what I think is the major flaw, I argue is the major flaw in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is that the finances, the resources don't match the ambitions that countries agreed to in 2015 at the UN. And I'll conclude with some final thoughts on what the bigger picture is for development for the African Union. And I suppose one of the main messages that I want to get across today is that certainly global governance and globalization plans of global development are shifting, and they're shifting quite rapidly. And this is a moment, I think, where there are a lot of threats to African development, but that also open up opportunities for African leaders. I'd like to kind of emphasize those. So maybe while I'm talking, you can think about what you think the threats and opportunities are, and we can discuss that at the end. And if you have any questions of clarification, then feel free to jump in while I'm talking, but otherwise we'll discuss at the end. Okay, so what makes international agreements work? So we did some research at the Centre for International Cooperation, and some of my colleagues identified 4 key ingredients for what makes an international agreement work. It could be about anything. It could be about non-proliferation, it could be about small arms and light weapons, it could be about development. But there's kind of 4 key ingredients in the recipe whether an agreement is successful or not. The first is that there's a clear political vision that's defined from the outset. It might be eliminating a particular illness, or it might be controlling small arms and light weapons. But there's a clear vision from the outset. Why do we want this agreement? Secondly, through the process of negotiation, there should be enough wins for enough constituencies, and you have to construct the process to somehow enable different regions of the world and different stakeholders to be able to negotiate what they want to get out of the agreement. Otherwise, it simply doesn't hold. Thirdly, I can see my numbers are mixed up, but never mind. Thirdly, the resources need to match the ambitions. So the UN is pretty notorious for coming up with agreements that look wonderful on paper, and there's wonderful ambition and magnificent things that will happen, but nothing gets translated off paper and into reality. So the resources really have to be in place to achieve concrete political vision that's been agreed. And fourthly, there should be accountability for progress. So there needs to be some kind of follow-up so that the world doesn't agree something wonderful and then forget that it agreed there until 20 years later and we say, look what happened. Okay, so that accountability sometimes is enforceable, and maybe there are some lawyers in the room, but sometimes there are enforcement mechanisms, sanctions or Security Council, whatever it might be. And the case of global development, all aspects of global development are really voluntary. It's all based on voluntary goodwill and cooperation between all countries. So accountability in development terms tends to be things like indicators and reporting on indicators and progress. And, a developing country, how far did they get? A rich country, how much money did they spend? It tends to be accountability on that level. It's very much about peer pressure and goodwill. It's not something that's enforceable. And there are some really good examples of international agreements that have these four agreements that have had a clear impact. So, who's heard of the Millennium Development Goals? Most people. Yeah. Okay. So the Millennium Development Goals really feature these four factors. So there was a clear political vision that this agreement was going to be about extreme poverty and zooming in, focusing on extreme poverty. There were wins for enough constituencies at the time in the sense that the goals weren't controversial. There was something all countries could sign up to, and there was a certain dynamic that developing countries wanted aid, and rich countries were willing to sign up to aid for these goals. The resources, there was new aid committed to meet the Millennium Development Goals, and there was a certain accountability in the sense that there was a huge international focus on the goals. There was a lot of publicity and communication. Even at the level of high schools in India, teaching children about Millennium Development Goals, and a lot of focus on data and tracking the data. Why am I saying this? Why am I going through this? Well, the point is that developing countries rely heavily on a rules-based international system for their own development. They need predictability and stability to plan and pursue their own development processes. In the era since the Cold War, more than 80% of development finance for the world, for developing countries in the world, has come from international trade, foreign direct investment, from aid. And so an international system that's based on rules and accountability is really important for developing countries in order to pursue their own long-term development. This is why the Sustainable Development Goals then count for developing countries of the African Union, because this is about making the international system work for them and working for what they want to achieve in terms of their own economic goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals, what are they? Do people have a rough idea what they're about, or should I just say a rough idea? Mm-hmm. Yeah, essentially you've got 17 goals, very ambitious, 169 targets. The process was agreed in Rio, at the Rio +20 conference, and it's based on these three pillars of sustainable development: economic development, social development, and environmental development. And it goes beyond the Millennium Development Goals, which were very focused on poverty, and it extends to looking at all of the root causes, not just of poverty, but of inequality and of environmental challenges, and sustainable development, environmental challenges, and so on. It's like a very broad-based, all-encompassing type of framework. And the reason that it's important is because if you're going to make more progress on poverty eradication in the world, you have to start getting to the root causes of poverty and addressing those root causes. You can't just carry on addressing the symptoms of poverty. We'll dig wells, we'll build schools, but we're not getting to the real causes of this. And so my centre did some work for the OECD while the Sustainable Development Goal negotiations were happening. And we looked at what it would take to make a huge dent on poverty in the world in the next 15 years, right? From 2015, when the goals were agreed, to 2030, which is the theoretical timeline for when all of the sustainable goals would be agreed. What we found is, if you look at the blue line, this is the base case. The base case assumes that nothing in the world really changes. That the countries that are on track with their development stay on track, and the other countries really don't budge in any real way. And the outcome is that you still have, you have roughly now about 1 billion people in the world that live in extreme poverty. And by 2030, if nothing changes, you'll still have about 1 billion people in the world that live in extreme poverty. What might change is the geography. So a few of those extremely poor people live in China or South Africa or India or Brazil. There's a risk of a growing concentration of extreme poverty in the African continent and in countries affected by conflict. In countries like Syria that have been So this is based on Hardy Futures model at Colorado, and it's based on certain assumptions around what does it take to reduce poverty. So it looks at economic growth. It also looks at institutional development, the building of systems. It looks at conflict resolution. So it factors in various features of what's necessary in order to reduce poverty, not just spending more money on the symptoms. So the DIP factors in various conflicts that have been happening in the world. There's growth and conflict in the Middle East, and that's led to a worsening of poverty statistics in the world because there's more people in the Middle East that have been pulled into poverty. So that's what the council did. But what I should say is this is just a model, it's not a prediction, it's to give policymakers insights. If you pursue these policy priorities, you're going to get these results, and if you pursue these priorities, you'll get these results. So essentially, if all countries just continue business as usual, doing what they're already doing, the result is that we have the same number of extremely poor people in the world, but they're more concentrated in Africa. The best case scenario, the green line, we could actually reduce the number of people who are extremely poor in the world by 500 million. But it would take a generational push to develop institutions, public systems around health and education, sanitation, and so on. And it would require an acceleration in economic growth. And that progress would really be needed by 2020 if you're going to be making big headway by 2030 in order to be sustainable development goals. Suffice to say, the sustainable development goals are extremely ambitious. So why, during the negotiations of the sustainable development goals, why do they matter, and what matters to the African Union? Well, like I said, I managed a program that involved different regions and different countries who all brought different perspectives to what was important to them about sustainable development goals. And there was a lot of controversy around the negotiations at the time because of the size of the ambition and the breadth of the ambition. So the economists, for example, I remember them arguing that the sustainable development goals would add up to a betrayal of the world's poorest people, because they argued that the focus just extended too far away from core focus on poverty into a wide range of issues. Professor Bill Easterly at University, he wrote rather, it's quite a damning critique of the SDGs actually, where he argued that 17 goals and 169 targets were about as likely to lead to poverty reduction and development as calls for world peace at this world context. So he really didn't think that this was going to translate into very much. But I would argue actually that there are some real strengths to the sustainable development goals and some reasons that the African Union got rather involved in the negotiations. The first is that the developing countries themselves actually led the SDG negotiations, and that's the first time that this happened. A lot of students look quite shocked when I say that previous development frameworks were written predominantly by senior Western officials and UN officials, and developing countries were on the receiving end of these frameworks. This was the first time that developing countries themselves set the overall framework and negotiated the overall framework. And they expand global development away from a simple, exclusive focus on poverty to a broader range of social, economic, and environmental concerns that affect rich countries as much as poor countries. For example, job creation, sustainable consumption and production, good quality and affordable education, reducing inequality. And these are challenges in the USA as much as they are challenges in developing countries. And there was a real focus, and I think the developing countries, the African Union included, were really ahead of Western countries during the SDG negotiations because they realized that globalization was unraveling to a certain degree. That globalization wasn't working for everyone. So they recognized that demand for lending was going up. There wasn't enough investment following the financial crisis in 2008. They realized that there was a real pressure not just to create enough jobs for a growing population in the world, but good enough education to train people to be able to fill the jobs that were going to be created. And they recognized that there was a growing inequality, a growing concentration of wealth in a small number of countries and a small number of individuals in those countries. And so that's why developing countries pushed for a very broad-based, very all-encompassing sustainable development goal specifically focused on what they felt they most needed to get out of the SDGs. And I'd summarize it as a focus on root causes of poverty, not just spending money on services that donors like to spend, but actually investing in root causes. A focus on building national institutions, legitimate institutions, and more national systems and sovereignty. And a focus on multi-stakeholder finance. So that's really where the African Union came from, and that's really how they contributed and shaped a lot of the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. But I think there were some real challenges that haven't been addressed and that the African Union knew at the time. So the accountability in the Sustainable Development Goal framework is pretty weak. I mean, you basically have 169 targets, and there's all kinds of different data sets and data systems out there. There's not always data for all of the targets. So really measuring, are we making a difference or not? And is this a result of the Sustainable Development Goals or not? It's really practically impossible to say. Secondly, I think there was a real challenge of leaving behind a lot of the unfinished business of the MDGs. So there's a move away from focusing exclusively on poverty to all kinds of issues around the oceans and above the oceans and below the oceans. And it's this huge, broad, encompassing agenda that you can't assume everybody's going to focus on. But above all, I think the major flaw in the Sustainable Development Goal framework, I would argue, is that the resources simply don't match the ambitions. No new aid was committed to the framework. No new finances were committed to implementing the framework. There's actually a tension drifting away from the poorest countries and the least developed countries in the world. It is actually going down to those countries. It's going up to countries affected by conflict, countries that are of geopolitical interest, such as Syria, such as Yemen, and so on. And that's all fueled by this geopolitical uncertainty that's happening. So, countries in Africa tried to address this challenge. And one initiative was Ethiopia, that hosted a Finance and Development Summit there, which brought together governments around the world to look at how do we get sustainable development goals financed. And they came up with some pretty good initiatives. They committed to increase domestic revenue, reduce the cost of remittances, which is the money that immigrants send home, so you can reduce taxes and tariffs and so on. They agreed to spending $300 per person on social protection in the world's poorest countries, on the world's poorest and most vulnerable people. And they committed to spending up to 0.2% of GNI on the least developed countries. However, that's pretty much as far as the framework went. No country committed any new aid, excluding some money for UN's climate finance facility. The private sector wasn't invited. Private banks weren't invited. In large part, that was resistance from developing countries who want to push for more aid, but the reality is there is no more aid. And I think, worst of all, finance ministers from the world's richest countries, from the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and other emerging markets, didn't show up to the conference. That was political games being played between the richest countries and the rising powers about who was more responsible for financing the Sustainable Development Goals. That transpired, I think, rather embarrassingly, than not showing up to the conference and sending more junior development ministers instead. So it's a real disappointment, and I think above all for least developed countries and for the African Union. So where does that leave Africa when it comes to taking these ambitions, the Sustainable Development Goals, off paper and into action? What's the financing gap? Well, look, I mean, there's all kinds of estimates out there, and there's no agreed way of really estimating how this can be financed. But here are some that UNCTAD, UN's trade organization, is quoted. So probably around 600 billion annual investment gap for all the SDGs. That's the extra money that the African Union as a whole would have to raise to achieve the SDGs. There's another research study that says actually no, it's way more than that. Just to achieve SDG 1, which is extreme poverty, would cost Africa an extra 1.2 trillion a year that they would need to find to achieve SDG 1. The World Bank estimates that there's about a $93 billion annual investment gap for infrastructure. which is about achieving all of those SDGs that are to do with job creation, agriculture, energy, and there's a huge practically every SDG is linked to infrastructure. And the Centre for the SDGs in Africa, in Kigali, estimated that all of this would add up to roughly a 20% increase per year in investment as a percent of GDP for every country in Africa. Now, obviously, these are only guesstimates, and every African country has to really look at what SDGs they want to achieve, where they are, how much it will cost. But the point here is not so much to obsess with the figures, but to convey to you just how big the gap is between ambition in the SDGs and reality. If we look in slightly more detail, just that one commitment in the finance and development agreement that came up in Ethiopia, which is to spend $300 per person, extremely poor people, on their own social protection. This is my centre. We worked out what this would be as a percent of GDP for some of the world's poorest and more conflict-affected countries. So you can see, Liberia, it's about 38% of GDP, Central African Republic, 32% of GDP, DR Congo, 44% of GDP. So the gap is huge, and that's just one single target in the finance and development framework about helping the world's very poorest and most vulnerable people. So, where then is Africa's finance and development come from? Well, here's an overview. So this graph represents some work that I did for the OECD on what the available finances are for development. And I should caveat that I wasn't only looking at Africa, so there are a few low-income countries in Asia in this chart, but don't obsess about that, because the basic picture is the blue line is remittances. So remittances are the largest source of finance that developing countries get. So remittances are from immigrants. So basically, immigrants are way more important and generous than governments, which a lot of people don't realize. The orange line is foreign direct investment. So you can see that's the second largest source of finance for many countries in Africa. But the total is actually quite small when you look at the global picture. So about 6% of foreign direct investment in the world goes to Africa and a few other very poor countries in Asia. So they have a long way to go to attract more foreign direct investment into their countries. Now you can see the green line, which is aid. Now you see how migrants and the private sector essentially eclipse aid from governments, but it fills a really important gap in development finance, and it looks on this chart to be pretty predictable. From 2000 to 2012, it looks like it's going up pretty steadily, pretty reliably to help developing countries. And then you have the final kind of maroonish, purplish type line, which is other official flows. That's OECD jargon for money that comes from things like lines of credit from India and Brazil for their own companies, or Chinese finance and so on. We don't have very good transparent statistics on financing from those countries because the OECD and the rising powers in the world constantly clash over how these things should be measured and monitored, and they refuse to share information with one another. But you can assume that this purple line is rather large now. If you could reflect China, it's gone right up. So China and the other BRICS will be increasingly significant. Now, although we thought that aid was an important, predictable and growing source of funding for countries in Africa, in fact, geopolitics drive really serious imbalances. So between 2000 and 2012, which was the latest data when I did the research, 22% of the aid in the world actually went to Afghanistan and Iraq. So we think that we're looking at a really level and generous line of aid going up and up and up, but actually when you exclude Iraq and Afghanistan, aid's going down to most developing countries. And it's also invested very disproportionately. So when you look at aid per capita, this is the top 9 countries, top 9 aid recipients in the world, and this is the bottom 41 countries in the world. So you see the difference in per capita investment. So this is Afghanistan, Iraq, Timor-Leste. There's two countries in Africa, in South Sudan and Liberia, probably because they're of major interest to the US, and the US probably is generous with those countries. This is where most African countries are. So we think there's huge volumes of aid going into Africa. When you pick apart the figures, and these were official OECD figures that they published, the picture isn't really that great. And a number of countries in Africa that over the same period actually really flourished. They managed to resolve their conflicts, they managed to build institutions like Sierra Leone. They became official aid orphans in that period. So an aid orphan means you're underfunded to meet your ambitions for development, which makes zero sense, doesn't it? A country resolves its conflict, it starts to develop its institutions. You would think that aid would respond positively to that and invest in that. Actually, it's the opposite. The aid goes to where the crises are, where the terrorists are, insurgents, conflicts, and so on, geopolitics. So there's a natural skepticism that I think has grown quite extensively in different African countries over time around just how effective aid is and just how much it's in the national interest to be an aid recipient and to rely on aid versus finding other sources of finance and other ways to pursue your development. So here's a kind of summary of the major challenges that Africa is looking at when they're thinking about how do we, my individual country or collectively, how do I achieve the sustainable development goals? So foreign direct investment, yeah, as a percent of GDP, it's pretty high. I mean, it's a really high percent of GDP in Liberia, for example, resource-rich country. But as a global total, Africa's really only attracting about 6% of global FDI that's available. So that's obviously an area of challenge, but opportunity as well that we pursue. ODA aid is declining and it's unpredictable. Last year, the OECD found that aid had remained constant in the world. But actually, when you look at where aid is going, aid went up for the refugee crisis, for countries in this kind of arc of instability, so-called around Europe and the Middle East, North Africa, to essentially manage the refugee crisis, but also, I think, invest in countries to keep migrants out of Europe. And actually, when you look at aid going into least developed countries, aid went down to 3% last year. So there's a concentration and intensification of that trend, geopolitical trend, you could say, and aid moving into national security interests and away from global poverty eradication. Remittances. Well, you saw, and many of you looked surprised, remittances are the largest source of development finance for many countries, not all, but certainly the populous countries like Nigeria, for example. But of course, in the current Western context, that's really challenging immigration. That poses a real challenge for developing countries, how they're going to develop and accelerate the development if they can't rely on a future source of remittance income. China and other official sources of finance, lines of credit from Brazil, India, and so on, certainly growing. And there's a growing movement around what's called South-South cooperation. So countries agreeing, developing countries agreeing among themselves what their aid framework should be and how they should be accountable to one another. But that's very much a nascent framework. And of course, in the context of various trade wars and intensification of struggles, difficulties between the great powers, it's quite uncertain for Africa what that, what, for example, a slowdown in growth in China would mean for African countries and become very reliant on Chinese investment. What's another major source? Commodity exports. The price of commodities crashed. There was a serious problem for Africa, Latin America for a number of years. They had to take out a lot of debt to sustain that. Now the commodity market's recovering. And there are some signs that there might be some new opportunities for Africa there. For example, Tanzania recently, they refused to ratify a trade deal between the East African Community and the European Union, citing Brexit, citing uncertainty around Brexit, leaving the European Union. And it's possible that some of the agricultural economies in Africa might benefit from Britain leaving the EU, because they might get some opportunities to export to Britain without agricultural subsidies. But it's not guaranteed, and it's a number of years away. So there's a real kind of recovering but uncertainty around trade. Domestic revenue is growing. A number of countries have signed up to various international commitments that they'll raise 25% of their GDP as revenue. But Global Financial Integrity estimates that Africa loses about $1 trillion a year in illicit financial flows, so money escaping the continent through various illicit means. So closing those loopholes would go a long way to helping Africa to finance its own development. But the systems need to be in place, and they can't be uniquely controlled by Africa. You know, Africa doesn't control Cayman Islands or Panama. It's a wider global system, and debt's been growing as a result of commodity prices. So, look, we can see that there are real challenges ahead. So, what are the opportunities? Well, I think there is going to be change and there is going to be pain as African countries try to finance their own development plans and the sustainable development goals. They're going to have to find ways to increase domestic revenue, which means that they're going to have political tensions with their own population. We saw that in Kenya recently, for example. Tensions between the government and the population about tax increases. Over time, that might be a good thing, but you'll see uncertainty in the interim. And I think the pressure is really on various leaders in Africa to work out, what their countries need to finance the sustainable development goals, and then they're going to have to innovate and find ways to tap into multiple sources of financing around the world, rather than just relying on aid as they often have. So these are some of the big ticket items that people talk about. We can discuss it in more detail at the end if you like. But the big discussion, certainly among African leaders and around the World Bank and the African Development Bank, is how you tap into global private finance. About $300 trillion of global financial assets in various forms. And I think the big question for African countries is, how do we tap into this finance and attract this finance into the continent? And there are various initiatives out there. So, for example, the World Bank raised a record $75 billion for 3 years for global development aid, and they pledged to match that with $3. Every dollar that they raised would match with $3 from global financial markets. The World Bank's created green bonds. You can buy green bonds now, which go into climate infrastructure, climate-ready infrastructure in Africa. There's various kinds of initiatives that try and pull public and private investments. So the African Development Bank and the World Bank invest in an energy initiative with the hope of attracting private investors into the same initiative. So that's one of, I suppose, the big ticket items. But there are other opportunities as well. You have multiplication of global public funds that involve lots of different public and private actors. Climate finance, could be about hunger, could be about education. And you have a range of governments, philanthropists, companies and so on, that are putting money into these kind of global funds. So big opportunities there to tap into those funds. And you have philanthropic funds that are growing about $70 billion a year now in global philanthropy. Philanthropists actually fund about 25% of the UN's development now, so this is huge. And then, of course, there are African initiatives that some of you may be following closely that are really interesting, such as the new program for infrastructure and development, the new program. There's discussions around introducing an African continental free trade area, which would move beyond regional areas. And of course, you have South-South cooperation, growing investments from China and India, and so on. So although these are kind of some of the short-term opportunities that I've pointed out that African countries will be able to pursue, in the long term and in the bigger picture, I think what we see is that a trend that Africa can't rely on Western countries to be a reliable aid aid investors as perhaps they once were. There's a need for Africa to tap into multiple sources of development finance, and there's a need for Africa to promote coherence between those different sources of finance, so that they don't have rival Western and Chinese, Indian, and so on, sources of financing that they're supposed to manage. So what are some of the opportunities I think Africa can pursue? Well, I think first of all, continue to work with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and other institutions to attract private investment, and to find the ways to attract private investment into energy, infrastructure, and so on. Secondly, increase focus on tackling tax evasion and illicit flows out of the continent. And that's really going to have to happen through cooperation with the G20, the OECD, the UN, multiple forums. Thirdly, I think there's a need to promote building coherence between the old and the new donors in Africa. And a big way, I think, to do that is to start to push for greater reform of the World Bank and the IMF, so that the rising powers in the world and larger African economies have a seat at the table in the World Bank and IMF executive boards. And that will hopefully promote more coherence with the new development institutions that are emerged, such as the new bank and the BRICS. And then finally, I think there's really a need for research. So the financing landscape for Africa is obviously changing. It's going to involve more philanthropy, more private investors, and so on. But we don't know what the impact is really on the programmatic level. We've got so much research about aid, but not about other sources of finance. And I think that research is going to be necessary to inform African governments in that sense. So the SDGs, they can succeed or fail based on whether or not they're financed. And a lot of this will come down to decisions that African leaders make. But if we don't get more and larger changes in thinking about how development cooperation works in the first place, I think you're going to find African leaders having to struggle with lots of short-termist kind of solutions and opportunism, rather than rules-based order that really works for them in the way that the post-Cold War world that supplied so much development finance did. And I think that's really the risk at stake that African countries will have to pursue quite aggressively if they're going to make sustainable development goals work. So that's how I want to conclude. But feel free to ask questions, jump in, clarifications, or what you see the main